This is Alex Kiley for FinalProject IDS-401. Um, so my topic was right-wing nationalism. Um, Right-wing politics and nationalism often go hand in hand. We see this very often in society. We see like Nazi Germany is probably the most biggest example, but in the modern age, specifically due to having to compete with a global market, certain segments of the population attempt to just kind of cut themselves off from the world, or shield themselves from the world, and they do this through very political means, primarily economic, immigration laws, or even electoral laws, voting rights. In modern times, with the increasing globalization around the world, it kind of heightens fears that the groups of people and countries are going to be left behind or outcompeted, or they're going to lose their jobs, or lose their culture, or lose their way of life due to the global forces that are kind of influence their nation. And so the nationalist tendencies kind of arise from that, and they align with right-wing politics. Oftentimes they kind of form an alliance between right-wing politics and nationalist politics to create support for governments that actually, if you look into it, you'll see it actually ends up hurting the very people they're meant to protect. So basically people vote for right-wing nationalist groups, and they thinking that they'll safeguard against them, but then they don't really end up doing that. It actually ends up working against the people that were voted in to protect. So this tends to affect the supporters of right-wing nationalism tend to be, for the most part, the older generations, the generations that grew up back before globalization really took a really came to really forefront of the world. So when the society is feeling pressure to adapt to the global norms, or feeling pressure to adapt to new competition, the pressure on the historical cultural norms in the area, like McDonald's restaurants replacing traditional restaurants, or foreign languages getting out-competed by traditional languages, so on. It leads to groups of people just outright feeling like they're under attack, and they feel isolated, and like they have to protect themselves. Global competition with other countries can also kind of push out their way of life, or their means of living, like manufacturing and mining in the United States is a good example, and like Appalachia and the Rust Belt, we kind of see this happening, where blue-collar workers used to be very strong supporters of left-wing politics. Now we see them more voting for right-wing and Republican politics. This is due to the nationalist right-wing tendencies that we're starting to see more of around the world, not just the United States, but around the whole world. So what I have here is a map of Africa showing how the literacy rate in the older generations is quite low. You can see the red and tan colors being relatively low, and the literacy rate in younger generations being quite high. What this shows is the older voters, the older generation is generally the less educated one, the one the millennial generation is generally the most educated generation we've seen in a long time, just due to all the available technology primarily. And so if you look into it, it kind of goes hand in hand with a tendency to vote nationalist or protectionist policies. Generally goes with the older generations. So the groups of people who tend to resist globalization tend to be those most closely tied to ways of thinking and social norms that existed previous to globalization and before global connectedness became as strong as it has. right-wing politicians have been having a difficult time attracting these young voters, exactly because the young voters do not associate with this older way of life, this pre-globalization way of life. They tend to associate more with a globalized life. So they tend to vote for the right-wing nationalist. And we kind of see a divergence of the generations between young people supporting more globally open politics and the older generations generally voting away. Like this example here, this is the Brexit vote in Northern Ireland. So this brings to the next point, national identity. National identity seems to be one of their founding principles. That's what's kind of their foundation in right-wing nationalism, in that the politics kind of play on people's fears of an outside group overtaking everything in their way of life and their national identity. And kind of we see this in Europe with the fear of Muslim culture overtaking Western culture, or the fear of terrorists coming into the people's countries. It generally leads to far-right political parties and their supporters having much bigger support. In this example here, we see people that identify more British than Irish. We can see the Leave the EU, the Brexit vote. Leave the EU is much stronger with people that associate more with British than Irish, and the Irish obviously voted to remain in. This is primarily due to the British people feeling as though the EU is attacking the British way of life, but the Irish feeling as though it's kind of a mirror image. The British are attacking the Irish way of life, so you have like two different nationalist policies going up against each other here. So in Europe, with the fear of Muslims and the terrorists and everything, we've even seen higher amounts of right-wing politics, especially in Europe, in Poland and in Hungary, Austria. Some places like Britain didn't even have far-right parties. Now, like parties like UKIP and stuff, they are generally becoming more numerous. With Greece, I think it's Freedom Party, I think it was called. And I know the Netherlands had a Freedom Party recently starting to pick up numbers. There are more slides on this showing how they've been gaining support more so in the last couple of decades. This is kind of like almost, I've heard the term preemptive revolution, saying that like the globalization is the revolution, and the nationalists kind of launch a preemptive resolution to prevent the revolution from fully happening. They want to close off the society, just stop globalization in its tracks, and cut off the global market, and just be an isolated nation again. This generally doesn't help them. The competition is still going to be there. It just generally ends up leaving them further behind than they were before. So this is an example of kind of a story of how nationalism kind of started in 1948. The British Nationality Act of 1948 granted subjects of the British Empire the right to live and work in the UK. The Act originally was designed to encourage people of British heritage, specifically white people of British heritage from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, to move to the UK. But of course, what happened instead is immigrants from the West Indies, Pakistan, and India all moved to the UK for the better working environment, higher wages, and they just generally started to outcompete the British for the more, sometimes even the skilled jobs. Like an Indian would learn how to become a medical doctor in India for a lot less than they would in the UK. They come to the UK and be a medical doctor for a much lower salary than say, a typical white British person would have. And the starts to interfere with the job market that they had, so the people of Britain started voting more conservative parties largely as a result of this. It's in response to legislation that was never even actually intended to make this happen. They still blamed the outside groups for whatever, even if the economic hard times were due to other things like the loss of empire or anything. They still generally the disdain generally got targeted at the people of color. So who does it affect? It really affects everyone. Right-wing nationalism you see it often end up hurting the poor instead of helping them. What happens is the globalized market in some ways does benefit them, and when you cut them off from it, the competition will still be there. So they're like the jobs don't come back like we see in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. The jobs just don't come back. That there's just much better investments to be made, like in China and stuff. So that voting in the nationalist, it doesn't really help in the end. It often just works more in favor of the corporations who can kind of swindle the politicians. But the bottom line is right-wing nationalism very rarely helps the people that initially support it. It often can end up just hurting them instead. So it's just generally not a very productive means of politics. So what are the impacts? The impacts range, from the most gruesome example of being the Holocaust to the current day of Britain leaving the EU, which the results of which we don't really know. We'll see how that goes. But and also in the U.S. we see generally states that have like the Republican, more conservative, more nationalist policies. They tend to target like minority groups and just the discrimination becomes higher. Like the tough on crime policies would be an example of kind of an awkward nationalist, and anti-immigration laws are nationalist to an extent. And we see like here an example the higher incarceration rates in the places that follow these right-wing politics. So the plan of action to avoid this would be to, I'd say, education is the number one weapon that we have to avoid this. Just education about diversity, globalization, culture, civil and human rights. Just teach them that it's really not the end of the world. It's possible to adapt and thrive, in fact, in this globalized world that we have, because the globalization is more or less here to stay. We can't just like build a wall and just cut ourselves off from it. It's not going to go away. It's like saying computers are going to go away. Like we're not going to make computers go away. So why would we just try to live in a world without computers? Why would we try to live in a world without globalization? So we need to teach acceptance, teach diversity, and also point number 2, work to reduce income inequality. Targeting true sources of it, usually like the big business, having the government so much in favor of big business is a source, can be a source of right-wing nationalism. The income inequality will rise, and the people affected by that will target minority groups rather than targeting the who's causing the inequality. Just in general, be more engaged in politics would be another key point to have. Just more voter participation, more critical of our politicians, and more active citizenry. Really, in the end, would be the primary ways of preventing people from playing on people's fears, basically, to work very much against them and not really do them any favors whatsoever, and actually cause a lot of grief and heartache for groups of people out there.